This is an introduction to the oil industry. What have we covered so far? We've covered energy policy goals, the basics of energy consumption and demand, externalities, and optimal resource extraction. Now we're ready to move into the specific markets, energy markets. We're going to start with the oil market. So let's go. Agenda for this module: what is oil? What do we make from oil? How is it produced? What is the market structure and a bit of the history of the oil industry? What does the global oil market look like, and what drives oil price trends and volatility? First, what is crude oil, or the chemistry of crude oil? Crude oil is made up of hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are molecules containing hydrogen and carbon atoms that release large amounts of energy when burned. The different products are classified by the number of carbon atoms. At room temperature, hydrocarbons with one or more carbon atoms are typically gases. 5 to 24 carbon atoms are liquids, and more than 25 carbon atoms are solids. A single barrel of crude oil contains thousands of different types of hydrocarbons. Crude oil from different reservoirs or different stocks, different parts of the world, differ in the combinations of these components. We have light crude oils containing more of the smaller hydrocarbon molecules. And these are more valuable because they yield more high-value products such as gasoline. The smaller hydrocarbon molecules are more volatile, meaning they're more flammable, they contain more energy, and they're easier to process. And so if you're a refiner, you want light crude oil. You get it's less work to pull smaller hydrocarbons out of a light crude. A heavy crude, in contrast, is denser and contains larger hydrocarbon molecules. The extraction, the transportation, and refining are all more costly. And then we have different levels of sulfur. There's sweet and sour crude. So sweet crude oil contains less sulfur. Sour crude contains more sulfur. Sulfur contaminants are bad. They make transportation and refining more difficult and expensive. So if you're a refiner, you want light sweet crude, but that's going to be more expensive to refine. But you'll get a higher yield of more profitable products out of every barrel of oil. Here's the refining process in brief. So if you see a refinery, you'll see these large towers. And these towers are called distillation units. And what they do is they basically heat up the oil. And as the oil heats up, it naturally separates into these larger and smaller hydrocarbon chains. The smaller hydrocarbon chains are going to rise to the top, and they can be siphoned off. And they're things like the gases, and then the gasoline. Naphtha is a high-value product as well that can easily be turned into gasoline. Below that, you get jet fuel and diesel, and then fuel oils and residuals, things that are used for everything from asphalt to plastics. What does crude oil make? On average, in a barrel, you get about 44.1% gasoline just by heating it up. Then we get 20.8% is diesel, and we have jet fuel at about 9.3%, and the rest of it is a variety of products that are used for asphalt and plastics and so forth. How is crude oil moved around? So you have imported and domestic crude. Domestic crude would be crude produced or extracted in the United States. Imported would obviously be imported from other sources like the Middle East, Venezuela. It's then refined into those products that we just talked about. And then it's shipped via pipeline to storage units, either at the refinery or in some bulk storage terminal. And then from there, it's shipped around the country in trucks to gasoline stations. Here's the distribution of the refineries and their relative sizes around the U.S. In 2020, there were 135 refineries in the U.S. The largest refineries, or the largest one, refines 603,000 barrels per day, or 25 million gallons per day. The smallest can be as small as 2,000 barrels per day. You'll notice where they're clustered um, down in Pad 3, the Gulf Coast. That's because we get a lot of imports of crude oil into that area. And so we want to refine the crude oil as soon as it's taken off of the boats. We also see some up on the eastern seaboard because we can get imports there as well. We also have some in the Midwest where crude oil is extracted, and some in the Mountain West as well. And then the refineries out on the West Coast are also there because of some extraction, but a lot of imports. Again, crude oil is primarily moved around the U.S. By pipeline, and here's uh, a map of the major pipelines in the U.S. You can see that there's a lot of movement from the Gulf Coast to the rest of the United States. There is a big gap between the East and the West, or the Midwest and the West, and that's because of the Rocky Mountains. It costs a lot of money to pump the crude oil up and over the Rocky Mountains, and so we don't see that happening much. I like to show this figure. What you're looking at, every one of these little orange triangles, is an oil tanker moving around the world full of oil. Any refiner in the world can, at any point, bid on any one of these boats, any amount of this oil. And so these tankers will move based on who's the highest bidder. So you might see one of these moving from the Middle East to the US, and then somebody in South America or China bids a slightly higher price, and then it all of a sudden changes direction. So this is a good this figure gives you a sense of the quantity of oil that's moving around the world at any given time and the size of the market. Finally, let's look at the sheer size of this market. How much do we consume? The average American consumes 500 gallons of gasoline per year. In 2017, the U.S. consumed 7.28 billion barrels of petroleum. That's an average of 19.96 million barrels of oil per day. The largest oil tanker holds 2 million barrels of oil. So these are the orange triangles on the previous slide. We consume 3,640 oil tankers per year in the U.S. So it's an extremely large market. And to give you a sense of the amount of oil traded on the futures market, which is a sort of teaser for the next module, we'll talk about futures. On April 14, 2010, 2.5 billion barrels of oil were traded on NYMEX in a single day. So that's 34% of annual consumption. So there's a lot of virtual oil being traded at any given moment.